Film is one of the most widespread and accessible art forms, and because of that, I feel it has less association with high art and the need for critical analysis as opposed to things like opera, classical music, classic literature, and painting. And with our current culture being so hyper-focused on capitalistic gains, our understanding and appreciation for art should be more of a focus. But film studies isn't taught in schools the same way reading, comprehension, and literacy is, so I'm going to go through an introductory dive into film studies and how to think about films as you watch them and get the most out of this fantastic art form. There are three main ways to divide up critically analyzing films. Those categories are form, content, and context. Form is probably the most obvious way to engage with a film, or really any art form. Form is the technical aspects of the film, the cinematography, acting performances, sound design, art design, etc. These are the tangible aspects of the film that are most obvious because they're the body of the film. What you see is what it is. Now that should mean it's the easiest to talk about and analyze, but that's not necessarily the case. See, although it's the more tangible aspects of a film, defining what a good part of that is very difficult and can overlap with content. There's so many different parts of the form, especially in an art form as complex as film, so let's break it down by parts, starting with writing. Writing is a seemingly easy part of the film to critique and engage with, and probably the thing most people that have never studied film can understand, because of the overlap with art forms like literature, and most people having an understanding of what writing is through English class or an equivalent. The most basic and well-known part of the craft of writing is the three-act structure. The three-act structure is one of the most abundantly discussed topics in all of storytelling, so I won't get into the details of that because most people watching this already know what it is generally, or if you don't, it is very easy to find things discussing it more in depth. But the bare bones understanding of the three-act structure is that a story is divided into three parts. Act 1, which is the expository part of the story, introducing the characters and the world, and particularly the normal world of the characters. Then that normal world is disrupted by some event called the inciting incident that sends the characters on a quest of some sorts that changes the world around them. That transition into the bulk of the film, Act 2, which is characterized by rising actions, the events of the story building to the climax. The midpoint usually has a shake-up before the climax happens, and after the dust settles, we are brought into Act 3, which is usually a return to the normal world, or establishing the new normal world. Now, there is plenty of variation in the three-act structure, but that's the bare bones of it, and it is an extremely effective way of telling a story. It introduces the aspects that are important, keeps you interested by changing the normalcy, builds to something you expect, subverts those expectations, pays off in the climax, and lets the dust settle in Act 3 for you to feel the emotions of the whole story. Some people argue it's overdone, some people would argue it's a perfect gold standard. Now, understanding the three-act structure is important for critiquing storytelling because when things don't line up with that structure, that can show the weakness of the writing. If Act 1 is too long, then you'll be bored by the normalcy of the world and wonder where the conflict is. If Act 1 is too short, then you won't be attached to the characters or the world, so the changes to them in Act 2 won't hit as effectively. But on the flip side, the three-act structure is not the only way to write a story. If everything was exactly the three-act structure, movies and stories would become very predictable and borderline boring, despite the structure's efficacy. But some films are designed without the three-act structure, and that works perfectly fine. If you go into a Wong Kar-wai film and try to analyze the plot through plot structures, you're going to have a bad time. Wong Kar-wai's films aren't focused on plot or story, rather his films deal with atmosphere and vibes. So to criticize his films for not following a story structure would simply be the wrong way to engage with his films. So when to judge a film by its structure or not can be complicated, and it's hard to give a definitive answer. But it seems like intentionality matters greatly. Clearly, Wong Kar-wai has no intention of making his films follow distinct plots. But if someone intended to have a distinct plot and just executed that plot poorly by making their Act 1 too long or short, then that would be potentially cause for criticism. Outside of plot, dialogue is an important part of writing that can be difficult to discuss as it's hard to define what makes dialogue good. A lot of people will assume that the best dialogue is the most realistic dialogue, the closest we can get to simulating real human speech. This is definitely absurd when you think about it longer. Firstly, the point of art and film is not to replicate reality, so a hyper-focus on realism is not the right way to go about this. Dialogue in real life is absolutely horrid. In the real world, people stumble over their words, interrupt each other or speak over each other, lose track of topics, misunderstand each other, and lack pretty much any eloquence at all. If you watched a movie with actual realistic dialogue, you would probably hate it and nobody would stay on topic long enough to get any ideas across. So it's not realism that we are worried about, but we do want these characters to speak like humans and say things that humans would say, just in a sort of elevated form, one that has central ideas and is witty or bounces off each other. However, this isn't always the case. Dialogue is a tricky thing. You want it to get the point across, but you don't want it to be too heavy-handed and expository. But just like when I discussed plot in a Wong Kar-wai film, some films need dialogue to be in a certain way than others. Certain styles require certain avenues of dialogue. A film written by Noah Baumbach is going to have closer to realistic dialogue. But a film by David Lynch or Robert Bresson is going to have very strange dialogue compared to real life. But David Lynch and Robert Bresson are two of the all-time greats. Bresson specifically had a very unique style to cinema that required an extremely minimalist approach to his characters and dialogue, and uses that specific style to evoke some of the most profound emotions of any filmmaker. But if people in a Noah Baumbach film started talking like a Bresson character, it would be clunky and out of place. These styles complement themselves, and just like how plot is, it depends on what the intention of the filmmaker is that determines what makes good dialogue. Cinematography is a uniquely cinematic part of the art form that is also hard to pin down the good and bad. The interesting part of cinematography is that it is mostly aesthetic, and discussing it can sometimes be rooted in vanity. However, I think good cinematography gets to the heart of what makes cinema so special. The feeling of seeing a wonderful shot is a uniquely cinematic experience and can elevate any film by giving you a powerful, visceral reaction. Cinematography isn't just looking good, though. A lot of times, cinematography can influence the plot itself, and the visuals of a film create the atmosphere that informs the emotions of the film.
I felt that when he made that phone call, it was so painful. We shouldn't witness it. So the camera should track away, but not pan away. It should move completely to a hallway. And in the hallway, you think somebody's coming, but nobody's going to come. Nothing's going to happen. We're all alone.
For example, a common theme within Hitchcock films is voyeurism, so you'll notice many of his shots are evocative of voyeurism, looking at people through windows or peepholes. Even just creating an obvious atmosphere like a horror film having dark shadows is important not only to looking good, but creating an overall experience of the film. Sometimes the visuals don't have to elevate the plot or themes. Sometimes simply a beautiful shot can fill you with such wonder that it pays off itself. Acting is another aspect of the form that might be the most difficult to describe what is good and bad. Good acting is often seen as high, intense emotions. Whenever you see compilations of the best acting performances, you'll always see Daniel Day-Lewis in There Will Be Blood.
I've abandoned my child! I've abandoned my child! I've abandoned my boy!
Or maybe Adam Driver in Marriage Story.
Every day I wake up and I hope you're dead. Dead like if I can guarantee Henry would be okay. I'd hope you'd get an illness and then get hit by a car and die.
They all seem to contain large, exuberant, and often angry, in-your-face performances. And while these absolutely are incredible performances, this isn't the only type of good performance. Subtlety can be a very important aspect in acting, and a subdued performance can be better than a flashier one depending on the film. It also depends on the director's style. David Lynch, for example, has a strange, more eccentric style, so his characters often talk and act strangely, but that's part of the point. I consider Naomi Watts' performance in Mulholland Drive as one of the best performances of the century, if not of all time, and yet you probably won't see her performance on those best of compilations because there's not really a large culminative moment for her to express a large, flashy emotion like in There Will Be Blood, but her performance is just as good regardless. Mentioning Robert Bresson again, his signature style is that of minimalism and aesthetics. He makes his actors have the most stripped-down, almost emotionless performances, which in another film would be considered a bad performance, but in a Bresson film, it is exactly what the film needs. So it's difficult to nail down and define exactly what makes a good performance because just like dialogue, realism isn't the goal. There is the concept of verisimilitude, which, in the context of film or storytelling, refers to the consistency of realism in a film, not a realism connected to real life. A good example is in fantasy. If you're watching Lord of the Rings, you accept the rules of the world. It makes sense for there to be magical rings and orcs and elves in this world, so it's not unrealistic when an elf fights an orc. However, if Legolas randomly pulled out an AK-47 and started mowing down the orcs, that would break the verisimilitude of that scene. This doesn't just apply to what is happening, it also applies to style. The Wachowski sisters' Speed Racer is one that comes to mind in regards to style. It is a bombastically colorful and electrifyingly fast film that earns its unique visual style. So a shot like this is perfect for Speed Racer, but would be disjointed and too fast or cluttered in another film. So acting is the same. It has to serve the purposes, aesthetics, themes, and atmosphere of the film. My point may seem repetitive that each aspect has to serve the film and isn't easily judged individually. Rather, a film's form should be judged holistically rather than in individual separate parts. I always like to say that a film is more than the sum of its parts. A film is a singular piece of art, not a collection of arts. Although you can point to individual aspects and say that the acting was good or the cinematography was a standout, to judge the film as a whole is to watch the aspects combine into a singular vision, all interconnecting to create one work of art. Each moving part of a film should be in service of the central core of the film. This distinction is what is most important to understand when it comes to criticizing or engaging in cinema. Tokyo Story has just as good cinematography as Kurosawa's Ran, because those visual styles work to elevate the core of the film. However, the cinematography for Wicked, for example, is not good, because the muted and desaturated colors detract from the whimsical, fantastical elements that is the core of Wicked. The next division after form for criticizing film is content. Content differs from form in the sense of content is what the film is saying, form is how it's saying it. Form concerns the technical aspects like acting and cinematography, whereas content is what those technical aspects are portraying, the story, the ideas, and the themes. I think content is sometimes harder to talk about than form because form's so in your face, whereas content has more subtext to infer. The screenplay is simultaneously both form and content, which can get confusing but also shows the overlap between them. In the form section, I discussed the three-act structure, a formal aspect of writing. But what is that three-act structure actually saying? This gets into the difference between plot and story, a distinction many people never make. Plot is simply the events of the story. You can make a bullet point list of what the individual events are, but the story is more of the why rather than the what. The plot of Jurassic Park is of a paleontologist and paleobotanist judging the safety of a dinosaur theme park and getting into trouble when the dinosaurs escape their containment. The story of Jurassic Park is about human greed and obsession with spectacle leading to a lack of responsibility with the chaos of science and the universe. The story of Jurassic Park is also about a crotchety man who hates kids and is put off by commitment, finding his paternal instincts in time of natural survival. The plot of Parasite is of a poor family slowly infiltrating the house staff of a rich family. The story of Parasite is systemic classism under capitalism, forcing the lower class into conformity, and any breaching of that conformity being beaten down by societal judgments and monetary punishment in order to keep the lower class subservient to the ruling class. The story is what the film is actually saying, plot is just how it's saying it. This gets into theme, a sometimes misunderstood but arguably the most important part of a film. The definition of theme changes depending on who you ask, and there are more ways to go about theme than most people think, and I like to adjust my understanding of theme as it applies to each movie. One of the most obvious and well-discussed approaches to theme is to think about it as the message of the film. This can be a bit of an elementary approach, but it's still an important step. What is the lesson to be learned from the film? This is easiest with children's films, because normally films geared towards children have more obvious and intentional messaging. The theme of Fern Gully is environmentalism. It can be as simple as don't pollute and take care of the environment. However, oftentimes there's more to theme, or there's another theme layered on top of the lesson. With Fern Gully, the lesson is about taking care of the environment, But there's an additional theme that mankind's hyperconsumption as a result of the Industrial Revolution is causing the destruction of the very resources we value for our consumption. I think stopping here when it comes to theme is wrong, but many people often do stop here. The theme is not simply the lesson learned, especially because many films are not supposed to be parables. There's different types of stories with different types of themes, and to restrict yourself to such a strict definition makes it harder to understand different and more complex styles of film. Another way to think of theme is in a more subjective, emotional way, especially when regarding specific types of stories. Sometimes the goal is not to learn a lesson or information, but rather just evoke something. This style of theme is prevalent in every film, but more relevant for films that tend to be more abstract or expressionistic. The greats like Andrei Tarkovsky and David Lynch spoke of this idea often, that a film is simply an experience, and the emotions of what you feel are what the film is about. Many people over-intellectualize these sorts of highbrow films, but their genuine meaning is whatever you feel when you watch them. If the ideas could simply be portrayed in words, then they would have been a speech. But these complicated concepts can't be expressed simply in words, which is why we use the language of cinema to express that idea. That means in order to speak on a film and its themes, we have to translate from the filmic language to our language. And just like translating between spoken languages, there's always something lost in translation. David Lynch famously said,
"As soon as you finish a film, people want you to talk about it. And it's, the film is the talking. The film is the thing. So you go see the film. That's the thing. It's a whole thing. And it's there, and that is it."
We can talk about movies and art, but know that every time we do, we lose a bit of what the film is.
And you will find that in great poetry. When you listen or when you read a great poem, it will occur to you very abruptly that there's a deep, enormous truth in this poem. And you feel like illuminated. And you don't have to analyze, and you don't have to read lots of literature about this very poem. You just know it instantly. And why do you know it? Because there's an ecstasy of truth that is in this poem. And in cinema you have this as well.
The only way to experience the ecstasy of truth that comes with art is to experience the film itself. It's difficult to determine if form or content is more important when it comes to judging film. My instinct is to say content is more important. What a film is trying to say is the most important thing. That's the core of a film. That's what the film is. Form is extremely important, and seeing a film fumble its profound messaging by its lackluster execution can ruin a movie. But the core of a movie is so essential, and I will always uphold the theme over the technical side. One of the biggest examples of this is the infamous film Birth of a Nation. Birth of a Nation was a 1915 3-hour silent film epic that revolutionized cinema, helped introduce narrative techniques that formed the standard feature film, innovated cinematic techniques like the close-up, and displayed the unprecedented grand scale that cinema is capable of. It is arguably the most influential film ever made. It is also one of the most vile, repugnant, and morally bankrupt films about the Ku Klux Klan protecting the innocent white victims from the encroaching black population. It's a deeply hateful movie with real-world consequences, cited as the cause for the resurgence of the KKK in the early 20th century, as well as being screened in the White House by Woodrow Wilson, famed racist and staunch segregationist. Talking about Birth of a Nation is complicated because it did influence so much of cinema from its foundation due to its technical prowess in its form, but I would never call it a good movie because its repugnant themes and content trump its technical aspects. Birth of a Nation is a bad movie, no matter how good the camera work and blocking is. The takeaway from Birth of a Nation is in support of a terrorist hate group, so the film as a work of art is dreadful and horrendous. There are different schools of thought when it comes to what a good movie is versus what a bad movie is, and this line of thinking will get you down the rabbit hole of what the purpose of art analysis is and makes you stop thinking of reviews as being good or bad, and rather being analyses of the art as a whole and the historical context that it resides in. A major aspect of film criticism that often gets overlooked is the context in which a film is made. This generally applies to films made in the past because we have the broader concepts of culture and society at the point that the film was released in hindsight. Looking back on films in the 1970s, it's hard to not apply the context of the Vietnam War to almost every film, especially those from America. The cultural landscape of the 1970s is incredibly diverse, with the fall of the studio system in the 1960s and the rise of postmodernist thinkings, influx of the counterculture, protests of the Vietnam War, and degradation of the ideals of the American dream, American exceptionalism, and American patriotism. These all heavily influenced the films of the 1970s, with the new Hollywood movement bringing young filmmakers to the forefront, portraying higher rates of violence, debauchery, and bleakness of American life, as compared to the classic Hollywood landscape a decade or two before. In a vacuum, these films portraying these aspects just apply to its own plot. However, with the added context of the socio-political climate of the 1970s, these attributes add to their meaning and paint a portrait of ourselves, our society, and our world in a broad and profound sense, making these films help us better understand ourselves, each other, and the world around us. It doesn't even have to add extra themes to the film, it could just support the themes or make them hit harder than before. Knowing that Godzilla was released less than a decade after the nuclear bombings on Japan makes the topic feel like a still open wound, and the recovery of Godzilla's destruction hits much harder. Fritz Lang was an Austrian-German director who flourished in Germany during the silent era. In 1933, Lang released his film The Testament of Dr. Mabuse, about an evil criminal mastermind named Dr. Mabuse, a character Lang shaped after Adolf Hitler, who was currently on the rise. By the time the film was going to be released, the Nazi Party had already taken power, and the film was initially banned for its portrayal of large groups of people overthrowing a power inspired by Hitler. However, the leader of the Nazi propaganda office offered Fritz Lang a job making propaganda films because of Fritz Lang's incredible prowess as a director. Lang declined the offer, moved to the US, and started making anti-Nazi films in Hollywood. Knowing this about Lang adds to the power of his films, displaying his bravery in the face of hate and power, and his steadfast resistance to fascism. Then he makes a film like Hangmen Also Die, a film about a group of resistance fighters fighting the Nazis, and releases it in 1943, still during the height of World War II. His film ends on a complicated tone of both somber and inspiring. Because the film doesn't depict the end of the war, the raging conflict isn't concluded by the end of the film. Knowing that this came out still within the war makes this a more powerful ending, because the filmmakers and audience still saw no end in sight to the war. So its ending matches that somber feeling of never-ending tragedy with the uplifting inspiration to fight against evil and tyranny. The movie in a vacuum is good, but the context in which it is made and released adds layers to it. To study and understand film is to study and understand culture and history, because films will always reflect the culture that they're in one way or another. Film history is history, and in order to truly study films and be a cinephile, you must grapple with film's connections with society, history, and the human condition. It's not just watching cool stories, it's a profound art form that portrays the world unlike anything we've seen before, and can take you to places you couldn't imagine. It's possibly the art form with the potential for the most empathy because of how it portrays the world in a seemingly objective fashion. It's also one of the most interesting art forms to study because of its complexities and contradictions. And I hope learning about the approaches to discussing and analyzing films helps you better grasp and appreciate how monumental of an art form cinema really is.